So what I'd like to come on to now is the question of whether English as a language is inherently suited to being a lingua franca, whether there's actually anything about the language itself that has kind of related to its rise as a lingua franca around the world. If you ask kind of normal people, as I think of them, you may be among these people, I don't know, but maybe your parents or... Sorry, I got distracted by... Oh, no.
No, you said you're normal people. I was going
I'll start. No, it's okay. I just thought I'd done something disastrously wrong.
No,
right.
Sorry.
So what I'd like to come on to now is this further question of how English actually relates as a language to being a lingua franca. And there's a kind of lurking kind of question of whether English is inherently suited to being a lingua franca. If you ask kind of normal people, you may or may not be among them, but I don't know, maybe your parents or your, like little brother and sister, something like that. And there might be native English speakers, they might be from abroad as well. If you ask normal people, a lot of them will say, yeah, English is inherently good as a language. It's kind of such a cool language that it's kind of had these successes in the world. Quite often people point to the idea that it's got a really rich vocabulary, that you can express yourself with so many different words. Sometimes people will say, oh, English is a really simple language. It's really easy to learn. So you do get this lurking idea that English is somehow an inherently good language. The guy who nominally runs Leeds University, a bloke called Melvin Bragg, wrote a book called The Adventure of English. You may or may not have kind of encountered it. He wanted to call it The Triumph of English. Fortunately, kind of the academics around him said, no, you can't call it that. English hasn't necessarily triumphed. And that brings us to this academic point of view of why English has become a lingua franca. And we tend to think of it as being much more about a historical accident and having nothing to do with the language itself. For example, when you look at kids learning languages, you'll find that they all learn languages at pretty much the same rate. It doesn't matter what language it is. It might be Tagalog, it might be English, it might be Icelandic, one of my favourites. They all seem to just get the same job done in about the same amount of time. And all people around the world communicate with about more or less the same problems using their different languages. So it seems clear that each language in the world can kind of carry about the same kind of communicative burden. So from that point of view, it looks like all languages are pretty much equal. And there can be no inherent reason why English would have become a lingua franca. It's just a historical accident. It's just a consequence of all of these different developments that I was talking about in the previous section about empire and all this kind of thing. I'd like to kind of throw out a kind of complication, though. It's a bit of work that I was reading just a year ago. It's brand new research. I think it's quite interesting. That kind of complicates this story a little bit of how English relates to its identity as a lingua franca. This is a bit of research by two gentlemen called Lupien and Dale, give their surnames. Can't remember their first names. It's one of the kind of horrors of academic referencing that you just know people by their surnames. Anyway, they did a bit of research where they looked to see if there's a correlation between grammatical features in languages and the number of speakers those languages have, which I thought was really intriguing. And by their arguments, there are indeed correlations between the number of speakers a language has and its grammatical features. And that's really striking. I mean, something needs to be explained there. If you have a look at the image that I've put up to go with this is just one of their various graphs. Hopefully you'll be able to see the reference to the article on the image too. It's available free access online, so you can go and look at it for yourself. And you'll see that we're looking, in this case, at inflected future tenses and non-inflected future tenses. What does that mean? Well, in English, I might say, or I don't know, I love my mum. My mum made the jumper, by the way. Or I might say, I will love my mum if she makes me a nice jumper. Obviously, I love my mum, I'm doing it now. I will love my mum, I'm doing it in the future. So we can express the future slightly differently. We've got different ways of saying things in the present and the future. But the word love never changed there. I love my mum, I will love my mum. Love just doesn't change. That's a non-inflected future tense. We express the future without changing the form of that verb. But there are languages where you would change the form of the verb. The one that comes to my mind, because it's the relevant language I know best, is Latin. The Latin for I love is amor, and the Latin for I will love is amabor. Amor, amabor. And you change the word, and it changes the meaning. It's an inflected future. The the striking thing is, when you kind of count up all the languages that are doing this and you count up the numbers of their speakers, you find that the languages that have the non-inflected futures have more speakers. And you can do this with a lot of grammatical features, and you kind of start to build up a pattern of kind of grammatical features that tend to be held by languages with lots of speakers, and grammatical features that tend to be associated with languages with very small numbers of speakers. And it's really striking. We just don't really know what to do with it yet. I mean, you might want to have a debate about it in class, I don't know. It's a really kind of intriguing problem. I had a long conversation with a colleague in the pub about this a couple of weeks ago, and she was like, this has just got to be rubbish. And maybe she's right. Maybe it's just that they haven't accounted in their data for the fact that Chinese has no inflected futures, and there happen to be a lot of Chinese speakers. It might just be kind of some statistical accident. But the authors of the article have done a good job to account for all these statistical problems. And they've got a really interesting explanation for what's going on as well. They try out the argument that when children learn languages, they, for some reason, get on very well with inflected forms. If you're a child learning to speak, say, Latin, the difference between amor and amabo works for you mentally. We know that children learn languages very differently from how adults learn them. When adults try to learn languages, they really struggle with these inflected forms, even if their native language has them. Adults find it much easier to learn languages where you say, I love, I will love. And it might therefore be that there's some kind of historical connection between adults learning languages and these grammatical forms, where, for example, as English expanded within the British Isles, you got all sorts of people who spoke, say, Celtic languages, switching over to English as adult speakers, something that's happened in reasonably recent history in Ireland, bits of Scotland, much longer ago in much of what's now England. You've got adults who are switching over to the English language, and they struggle with kind of inflected forms of this kind. So they start to find other ways of doing it, just using separate words. So it might actually be that there are linguistic characteristics that are characteristic of languages that have had big phases of expansion and rapid phases of expansion where lots of adults have had to switch language really quickly. In which case, actually being a lingua franca might change a language. As China expanded, as the Chinese Empire expanded and people switched to speaking various dialects of Chinese, they changed the language. Those people who changed the language then actually became powerful, and other people in China started to emulate them. And those linguistic changes started to spread. So it might be that we can see lingua francas or languages that are being used as lingua francas changing to adapt to that circumstance. And that can have really far-reaching consequences for a language. And sure enough, Chinese and English are relatively simple on the big scale of things. Tiny languages that might have, say, 7,000 speakers, 700 speakers, tend to have the most kind of amazing kind of complex inflectional systems. Make of it what you will. The jury's still out. There's a lot of debate still to be had and a lot of research still to do, but I'm quite intrigued by this idea that English is relatively easy for people to learn compared with a lot of languages. I think that's very interesting. And also that relative simplicity may come from early stages of the expansion of the Germanic languages and in turn English, a Germanic language itself, as they were learnt by other speakers. Yeah, so this is bringing us on to the idea that English is actually being changed by its usage as a lingua franca. And it brings us on to a whole kind of range of political and cultural questions that relate to the rise of English as a lingua franca. And you can take very different political views on this, and I'd like to present a couple of those views, maybe present some of my own as well, and leave you to kind of be able to think about those and debate them, maybe follow them up by reading some of the literature that I mentioned, maybe talk about it in class, you know, see how you go. And my fundamental question is whether the rise of English as a lingua franca now, in that kind of late globalizing stage, when it's not to do with empire necessarily, whether that rise of English now is a grassroots movement. Whether we should think of the rise of English as a lingua franca as one that is taking place because of individuals just making a choice, a free choice, acting as of their own free will to kind of take on this language that's simply useful to them, or whether we should see this as a kind of ongoing oppressive example of the heritage of empire, imperial exploitation, of capitalist exploitation. So I'd just like to give you a couple of quotations. It's a bit of a kind of slow and clunky way of communicating it to you, but I want to give you the sense that there are books out there that you can actually kind of get hold of and read. You know, if you find I've gone too fast, you know, you can just pause, read the stuff for yourself, no problem. But here we go. I want to give you first a guy called Jan Svartvik. He's a Swede, writing in collaboration with a guy called Geoffrey Leach, a British guy, and what they kind of have to say about the recent rise of English in the kind of globalised world. It is a new feature in the history of languages and language learning that this demand for English comes largely from the grassroots, not from society's elite, as was the case with Latin forced down the throats of previous generations of school pupils, or as the English language itself was imposed in earlier times on speakers of Celtic, Bantu, or many other languages. The most remarkable thing about English today is not that it's the mother tongue of over 320 million people, but that it's used as an additional language by so many people all around the globe. So that's really quite a positive sounding narrative. Like I say, it's a grassroots movement, it's bottom up, people want to do this, it's not being rammed down their throats. I'd like to kind of compare that with another perspective from a guy called Robert Phillipson, who's written a lot of kind of very provocative and interesting stuff about this. Some of it's in book form, but a lot of it's free access on the internet as journal articles. He's very good about putting that stuff up, so you can totally track it down. Here's one of the things he said about this stuff. There is a strong measure of wishful thinking in the projection of those who claim that English is the world's lingua franca, since maximally 1/3 of humanity have any competence in the language at all. Likewise, the notion that English is the language of science is contradicted by the fact that many other languages are used in higher education and research. But such discourse serves both to constitute and confirm English dominance and American empire, and the interlocking structures and ideologies that underpin global English and corporate interests. So, on the one hand, we've got a very kind of positive, happy-clappy narrative about this. On the other hand, we can say, well, you know, empires are dead, but actually economic empires, the spread of capitalism, and all of the social problems that go with that, all of the exclusions and sufferings, as well as the kind of inclusions and successes. English as a lingua franca is bound up with all of that, very complex and problematic process. And it's very easy for me as someone who teaches English, for your teachers at school, maybe for you yourselves, to become complicit in that and go, yeah, English is just really convenient for everyone, everyone's happy to use it, we don't have to learn more languages, and everything's rosy. But actually, in some ways, we could maybe see people kind of learning to use English as a lingua franca as being no more voluntary than you, for example, finding yourselves in a recession in the early 21st century caused by a bunch of random bankers who were just kind of each other's mates and lent each other stupid amounts of money and caused you to suffer. Maybe English as a lingua franca is as impersonal and hard to control, but also as pernicious and problematic as that. And one of the ways that people have started to think about English as a lingua franca to kind of get out of this kind of tension is to start to say, well, yeah, English as a lingua franca is a language of its own. It has its own life. It's still very common at the moment for people to say, well, native English speakers, whatever they say is just how their English works. And you'll be used to that, I hope, from your A-level studies. A descriptive, not prescriptive approach to linguistics. People have often then kind of said, well, if it's not your native language, then you actually can make mistakes. If it's not your native language, you can fail to say things properly. Non-native speakers ought to be learning or aiming to speak like native speakers. And there's some recent work that's really pushing the idea that English as a lingua franca should be understood in its own right. A woman called Jennifer Jenkins has been doing a lot of work on this. Again, quite easy to track down on Google. And of course, there's then like the possibility that's out there that English as a lingua franca is just this fleeting moment in the history of languages, not least perhaps because technology may just take over. A guy called Nicholas Ostler, again, good web presence, has got some interesting thoughts on this. Even at the moment, if I want to read a web page in Icelandic, I can just go to translate.google.com and it will give me a fairly good text in English. Computers are getting reasonably good at this now. I worked my way through a Japanese university website the other day just via translate.google.com, and I know no Japanese whatsoever. How long will it be before we really do have the kind of proverbial Babel fish of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy just plugged in your ear so that we can just communicate with other people through our mother tongue with them hearing us in their mother tongue? The possibilities are open. So how has English become a lingua franca? Basically, accident of history. But of course, it hasn't become the lingua franca. There are loads out there. There are loads of different languages. There's a whole diversity in the world. And English rising as the kind of dominant lingua franca is both enabling and exciting and empowering, but also problematic and exclusive as well as inclusive. And English is itself changing as a result of being a lingua franca. English as a lingua franca is a language in its own right and may well start to influence the language that you and I speak in our everyday lives. Thanks very much for your attention. That's me on English as a lingua franca. Hope you found it useful. Hope I haven't filled your heads with nonsense that your teachers then have to unpick because it doesn't go with the A-level syllabus. And hope you enjoy following up some of these names and ideas on the internet or in the library. Cheers.